Okay, now I'm starting over part 2. Okay, that got cut off when I took a break. Alright, so, as I was saying in part 1, so Robin had said, you know, go to LA, call her up, tell her you're in town for a day, and catch her on the spot, you know, and say you want to meet for lunch. She suggested that I just don't wait for Julia to get courageous, because Julia was probably afraid of me, and maybe she was, you know, whatever, so I should take the ball in my hands. So I thought that was a good idea. And so then, one day my mother, Ethel, the mother I grew up with, informed me that she was going to be out of town for a couple weeks and that I could come to LA and stay in her apartment. So that was going to be my time to go to LA, because Ethel, my mom, would be gone. And, you know, I was telling her, she knew about this all the steps I was taking to meet Julie the whole time. She was pretty okay about it, maybe a little jealous here and there, but, you know, I was telling her about what was going on with my sister and everything too. In fact, in this photo, what the fuck? Where's the camera? It's the strangest phenomenon. Oh, here we go. In this photo here, Ethel and Nikki met. That's Nikki right there, wearing a Kleagle t-shirt, and this is my mother. So this was a later visit. But anyway, oh, no wonder. Okay. So, so I arranged to go to Los Angeles, stay in my mother's apartment, and without having told Julie already, I was going to call her up while I was in LA and do this thing about, and see if she would agree to meet me for lunch. We'd have lunch, and that would be that. Now, I want to mention this part before that, because just to add to the emotional drama, that's why the reason I'm telling this story is to include all the little steps of emotion. When I was back in Berkeley, before I came to this day, I had this cleaning job. I used to do house cleaning in the Berkeley Hills. I had a lot of clients there, and one of the clients that I had was an older gentleman who was a professor at UC Berkeley, who was the husband of the late Dorothea Lange. If you look Dorothea Lange up, she's a famous photographer, and she had passed away, and her husband lived in this big house in the Berkeley Hills, beautiful 2-story house in the woods. And so he had hired me to be the cleaning person, which I did for a few times. And basically I'd get there, and, you know, he would just leave me alone. He'd go out for the 4 hours, and then I would clean. And one particular day, there was this one room in their big house that all of Dorothea Lange's pictures were on the wall, and there was these rocking chairs and beautiful wooden furniture. Everything was beautiful wood, big picture windows that looked out in the backyard and the forest. And I'm dusting, you know, a lot of dusting in there. So I'm dusting, and I didn't know, I hadn't really studied Dorothea Lange's work, but of course in this room, which was like her library, the book was there, and so I'm looking at it. Oh, this is Dorothea Lange. Look, she did this famous photograph, and her husband was a real nice man, you know. Anyway, he was gone, so I sat down in a chair to take a rest, and I'm looking out the window and thinking about this pending meeting with my birth mother. And I was just sort of trying to like pick up on what she was like and things like that. Actually, maybe this happened before I talked to her, but the reason I'm mentioning this event, this day, because I kept seeing the color yellow. Like, I just had this impression staring out the window about yellow. And I can't remember the details, but the color yellow was just stay with me. Okay, so that was that. So fast forward, I go to Los Angeles. I'm staying in my mother's apartment, and I got up the nerve, and sure enough, I called Julie up. She answered the phone. I said, "This is Stephanie again." And I says, "Well, guess what? I'm in LA. You want to meet for lunch? I only have a day to stay, and I gotta go back." And sure enough, she said yes. In fact, the interesting thing was that Nikki was not in town. See, at that time, Nikki was living with her in her house, but the timing was such that Nikki was out of town. My mother was out of town. Julie was talking to me freely. I realized that Nikki being around all the time was inhibiting for Julie and for me. Well, in this moment, I'm talking to her on the phone. She goes, "Sure, let's meet." So the coincidence of that was bizarre because I didn't know Nikki was out of town either. I thought Nikki was going to be around. But the goal was for me to meet my birth mother without anybody else around. You know what I mean? That was the goal. Well, God put it that way. So Julie says to me, "Sure, let's meet tomorrow at such and such a restaurant." So she mentions the restaurant. I write it down. I have my mother's car. And I'm like, oh boy, finally we get to have lunch together and meet each other. Okay, so I'm all nervous. And what am I going to wear was the next question. So I had brought some clothes with me, but I went into my mother's closet to look at her clothes to see if any of her clothes I might want to wear them. You know how it is when you go through what to wear. You're going to meet your mother for the first time. What do you wear? So I found a blouse in my mother's closet that was yellow. And I thought about that day cleaning Dorothea Lange's house about how the impression of yellow came. So I said, oh, well, I guess I was having a signal to wear yellow. So I wore yellow. I put that blouse on. So we're supposed to meet at 1 o'clock at this restaurant, which was off of, like, you had to, it was in Van Nuys somewhere, and you had to go across Van Nuys Boulevard. So, believe it or not, I didn't have very much money, and I wanted to buy her lunch, and I hardly had any money. But I had a bag of percussion instruments. In those days, I was making shakeries. I just started making shakeries, and I used to sell them for like 30, 40 a piece. Well, I had about a half a dozen with me that I brought on the trip, thinking I might go to a music store in the valley and sell some then. But anyway, I looked up and I knew there was a pawn shop on the way, and I left the house like a couple hours before the 1 o'clock meeting with the shakeries in the duffel bag in the car. I get to Van Nuys Boulevard, and there's a pawn shop. I said, well, man, I'm just going to freaking give me 20 bucks so I have some money. I didn't care how much money I got. I gave those shakeries away. The guy bought them, and he just gave me enough to have lunch. He didn't, you know what I mean? When you trade, the value of something changes depending on your needs, basically. So instead of getting a couple $100 I would have got in a normal transaction, I got just enough at the pawn shop, you know, to have lunch. So then I go out to the car, which was parked there, and I had locked the keys in my mother's car. And I had like a half hour to get to the restaurant. You know what I mean? So I'm like freaking out. And believe it or not, there were people walking up and down the street. I found this man. I says, oh my God, I'm locked out of the car. He goes into a shop there and he gets a coat hanger. I kid you not. And he breaks into my mother's car and unlocks it for me. Right in the nick of time. And I get in the car and I drive to the restaurant. So, as soon as I drive to the restaurant, I get there and I see it. I don't remember the name of it, but it had this huge, it was like maybe some Italian name or something. And it was a restaurant Julie went to a lot. So I see this restaurant. I had this big awning in front, like outdoor seating and everything. And guess what? The awning and the whole roof of the restaurant was yellow. Yellow. And I drive in like, here I'm going to see my birth mother for the first time, and all this yellow. This was the third yellow. So that's why I mention this, because it was sort of a little premonitory thing. Let's leave it at that. But anyway, that was cool. So I drive up and I park in the parking lot to meet her in the restaurant. And and as I'm walking to the restaurant door, I see a woman get out of her car, and it was her. And so the first time we met was at the entrance to this restaurant. And her hair was cut like short, and it was kind of had grayish mixed with brown, and she wore glasses, and you know, she looked a heck of a lot like my mom in the way, the mannerism that she was dressed and everything. So we sat down, we got a table and sat there, and you know, she was really so nice. She was smiling, she was looking at me. It was as if there was no problem. We sat down, she got a drink of alcohol, and I wasn't a real alcohol drinker, but I got one anyway. And Nikki had told me that she was a steady kind of a drinker person, and that she loosened up a lot with alcohol, and without it she didn't loosen up. So we sat at the table, and there we are. And it was the best meeting. It couldn't have gone any better. Like I say, she was all relaxed, and she says to me, ask me anything you want. And before that, I had, you know, I didn't really have too much proud things to say about my life, because at that point I was kind of I didn't have this big fat career, but the fact that I was a musician, she was all ears about that, and she told me like Nikki had a tin ear. And Julie herself had a music gift, and she had been on the radio at 6 years old playing the piano. She was schooled in that, so she was really happy to hear that I was a musician also, and I played by ear, and my forte was a guitar and stuff. But at that time I was really into African music, and I was making these percussion instruments which look like rattles of no significance to people in Hollywood, if you will. The whole African music scene was not very well known about, so I wasn't really a big seller at the time. I was just starting out. But it was my insecurity that kind of didn't, well, anyway, just to say that. So we're having lunch and everything, and she said I could ask her anything. And I asked her about my birth father. And that is the first time she told me his name, Melvin Lee Dobro. And then she said, she confirmed that he said he had Comanche grandfather. And she said to me, she says, well, if you find him, you probably won't like him. And then she confirmed the story about how they had an argument or a fight about the pregnancy, and that I think she told me this herself, because it's not written down. And I don't think Nikki told me, so if my memory is correct, Julie herself told me this, that they had an argument and that he hit her in the face. He slapped her, and then he walked out of the apartment. And she said to me that, or she indicated how devastated she was, because she said, well, with your sister's father, I didn't, she says kind of like this, she goes, well, with your sister's father, I really didn't enjoy the sex, and it was kind of a date rape situation. But then she says to me in the restaurant, she goes, but with your father, I learned what sex was really about. Like, she learned, and she liked it with him. So that was the most significant drop of information, because it completely explained what I inherited from her in terms of my attitude and my sexual life. she's telling me that she had good sex with the father, and then she gets pregnant, and then they have a fight. He denies paternity. He hits her and he leaves, and she never sees him again. Now, in the birth records, in the papers here, all this little stuff, she contacted the adoption agency all the way in her 9th month of pregnancy. I don't care if she hears this video. So you can imagine, you know, you're kind of like infatuated, whatever, with this guy, and that you're having good sex, and then you get pregnant, and, you know, maybe she was thinking she would hold out to the last minute, maybe he'd come back, but because he had this Comanche bloodline, nowadays someone might be proud of that, but back in the 50s, I saw this, I can't find it now, but there was sort of a law on the books of Los Angeles County that there was like almost illegal to fornicate with an Indian and a white person, or in other words, Mr. Dobro could have easily gone to jail or been under pressure having gotten me pregnant. And it's just kind of a conclusion that their relationship might have been secret, unwanted. You know, at the time she met him, he was a draftsman. He had spent a year in the Army, and he lived in Hollywood, and she wrote in this paper, it says that he liked rodeos and stuff. So, you know, you can imagine in the 50s this, and he was dark complected, and you know, you can tell he was kind of enough of an Indian that it was noticeable, and it was also going to be highly looked down upon, genetically speaking, by Julie's family. But for whatever reason, Julie liked him and all that. So, and then they had good sex or whatever. So I'm meeting my birth mother. She's telling me this, and everything's falling into place, like what I had inherited. Even my propensity to be involved with, for example, the African race, you know, and just having an easy way of getting on with other groups of people beside my own white Jewish alleged culture kind of thing. So anyway, and I say the term race, I mean culture actually. So my whole life since that time in Berkeley is when I first got involved with African music, learning how to play mbuta, having boyfriends. I just went out only with black men for a long while during that time I lived there. It was like my past life had come up in my African consciousness, subconsciousness with that whole thing. But it had a lot to do with the fact that I was kind of a half-breed to begin with. Like, you know, back in the day when Cher and Sonny and Cher came out, and Cher came out with that song, Half-Breed. Half-breed, that's all, you know. I wasn't quite a half-breed, I was like a quarter breed or whatever, but that was in my psyche also, before I even knew about Melvin Dobro. So anyway, she told me about his name and his birthday, and she was smiling, you know, she had a good memory of him. So, so that was that coincidence. And I just want to say one more thing about that, and then am I almost over with the meeting her story. Oh yeah, so I go back to Berkeley, and people that are listening to this that were adopted, you may relate to this moment, but I was on Telegraph Avenue. I used to sit on Telegraph Avenue in the 80s and sell things on the corner of, like in front of Cody's bookstore, on the corner of Telegraph and, was it Durant? I forget the corner. But there was a lady friend of mine named Teferet, and she used to sell bumper stickers and t-shirts. She was always there on the weekends in front of Cody's bookstore, right across in the Mediterranean Cafe. And my 6 years in Berkeley were, you know, what they were. But anyway, I came back from meeting my birth mother, and I go up to Telegraph, and there was a thrift store up there, and I was going shopping, and I go in the thrift store, and there was a full-length mirror, and for the first time in my life, I looked in the mirror, I tried something on, I stand in front of the mirror, and I looked at myself in the mirror for the first time. I didn't shy away from the mirror. I will never forget, and this is the part about meeting her that was so profound for me, because the cells of my body were like feeling like grounded and completed, and when I looked in the mirror, I was aware consciously that I was not self-conscious. I don't know how to explain it, but I looked in the mirror at myself, and I didn't have any self-consciousness like I always had. Still get it now even. But I'll never forget that day. I'm looking in the mirror, and it was like 100% A-OK. Because I knew myself in a cellular manner, is all I can say to you, after I had met my birth mother and found out all these little factoids that most people grow up knowing these things. But the puzzle piece of meeting her had put the whole puzzle together to the point where I could then go back home, look in the mirror, and be comfortable with my image. That was how profound it was to meet her, and that was my goal. That was why I wanted to see her, but I didn't realize how it was going to have an effect on my self-esteem. This is a really big issue, because there's a book called The Adoption Triangle that I read back in those days by Betty Jean Lifton. And she did kind of surveys, you know, and a lot of adoptees did what I did. They ran away from home. They have this psychology profile, this, that, and the other, and low self-esteem. Interesting they use the word low, but I would almost call it a void in there of self-esteem, is part of the result of being adopted in a secret manner, where you are not allowed to know anything about your genetics. This is like the crime against humanity. What I think about this secrecy part is that the people who genetically adopted me into the Jewish family, the Hollywood Jewish family, I guess what they thought was, well, they take a baby in the raw and bring it up, and the environment of that child is going to be the predominant influence of that child, and the child is going to get used to it. But no, you never ever forget where you came from on some level. You just don't. You inherit from your biological family, whether you like it or not. And the thing about the birth father that was also profound, way back to when I got all these documents that describe the social worker's interaction with my mother and why she was giving me away. All this is written in here. I wasn't supposed to have this. The agency sent it, but nowadays they won't even, you know, I called them up recently and they said, you're not allowed to have it. I said, well, I got it a long time ago. So anyway, the point being, the secrecy, they still hang on to the secrecy. It's a shame. When I saw in those documents, in fact, let me see if I can read it. It said, Julia named as the father of her baby blank blank blank, and now I knew it was Melvin Dobro, whose last address she gave as being on Catalina Avenue in Hollywood. Oh, he was the guy who lived on Catalina Avenue. She stated that he was born November 14, which is very significant for those of you who know about John Podesta and his hands, and the number 14, just saying, 1932 in Texas. She said she had informed him of her pregnancy, but he denied paternity and was extremely uncooperative and unkind to her. And so she's the one that told me, yeah, they had a fight, and he slapped her in the face. Julie said that he was of Protestant faith and French descent. She stated that his grandfather was a full-blooded Comanche Indian. Okay, so she stated that his grandfather was a full-blooded Comanche Indian, so that would put him as being quarter Comanche, me 8. She described him as being about 5'8" and 5'8" tall, weighing about 150 pounds, having dark brown eyes, black hair, and a dark complexion. She said that he had completed high school and 1 year of college and was employed as a draftsman. Julie said she thought he had been in the Army and that she did not know too much about his recreational interests, although she knew he enjoyed horses and rodeos. She did not speak much of this man except to say that she had not gone out with him for a very long period of time and to express feelings of intense dislike for him. She said that one reason she did not feel herself attached to the baby or did not mind too much giving the baby up was because she disliked the father so intensely. Now, when I first read this and I saw the word Comanche, part of the reason I freaked out and is because when I was 15 or so, there was a jewelry shop where you could go buy findings and make your own earrings and stuff. And my mother and I went down there one day on Saturday. We used to always go shopping on Saturday. And we're in this big jewelry store, and I found this bracelet. It was an armband, the kind you wear in your upper arm, and it was a snake. You know, a silver, nice little snake. My mother let me buy it and wear it to high school. I liked snakes even back then. So I'm wearing this snake to high school, and the first day I took it, I remember I looked, you know how you wear your stuff to high school. I actually gave the snake a name, and I named it Comanche. Of all the names on the planet Earth, I named my little snake bracelet Comanche, and this is when I was 15, before I knew anything about the story I'm telling you. So when I saw that my father was a Comanche grandfather, I'm like, this is what I mean by you don't know what you remember. Somehow, and my parents who adopted me didn't know the Comanche part. I'd never heard that growing up at all. There's a lot of Indian tribes, you know, and a lot of mixed breed and all this, but there was never, don't ask me why, but I just named that snake Comanche. And later on in my life, yeah, I have kind of a, well, you might say when I started having past life memory and then readings from channel sources about who I am and everything, that Indian part came up quite a bit to the point where maybe I am that great-grandfather. And then my relationship with snakes really evolved. I have tons of snake stories where I've gotten along with snakes pretty good. My mother, back when I was 15, even bought me a snake for my birthday, a little boa constrictor. It was a baby. It was like a foot long when she bought it for me as a pet. And I ran away from home shortly after that, so I was never able to take the snake with me. That's a long story that I'm I'm writing a book, so I'm going to write that in the book, but when I ran away from home at the age of 16, I left that little snake at my mom's house. I disappeared for several years. No one knew where I was. When I showed up again 5 years later in 79, I ran away in 74. When I showed up in 79, I find out that my mom and my brother had kept that snake. My mom here, Ethel, had kept the snake in the apartment until it was like 6 feet long. My brother fed the snake. They kept it as long until it died. They kept it like 3 or 4 years, and then it died for some reason, but they told me the snake liked living in the box spring under my brother's bed. And, you know, it was a full-fledged boa. He had to buy it mice and then rats and feed it. But that was so sad and heartwarming in a way that they had kept my snake, hoping I'd come back. So, anyway, that's that story. So, okay, so in the 80s, yeah, I met my birth mother, and now I knew Melvin Dobro's name. And the fact that his last name was Dobro, I talk about in my other videos, Searching for Comanche Father. That was crazy because here I'm a guitar player, and Dobro is a guitar, obviously. And I talk about in the other video how I went back to Berkeley with a name, and because of Alma helping people find whatever, I went back to the Alma meeting. Like, okay, I might as well tell this part. So I get back to Berkeley, and then it was time to go to the Alma meeting and tell everybody about meeting my birth mother. I think I did, but I'm sort of missing this one part, because after I found her, I went to the Alma meeting, and that's when I had to get up and tell everybody that she didn't want to meet me. Well, then I did meet her. Anyway, let me just jump around. I'm telling this story kind of for factual storytelling later on, in case it's just sort of a document of what happened. So I go back to Berkeley knowing my father's name, and I go to the Department of Motor Vehicles in El Cerrito, because I was living near El Cerrito. And in those days, in the 80s, you could walk up to the window and say, hey, I need to know the address of this person. You could give them the name and the birth date, and they would give you the current address of the person. I kid you not, because that's what happened. The lady, I gave her Melvin Dobro, November 14, 1932, and I don't even know if I had to tell her anything, and she comes back with this printout, which I don't have, which told me that his present address, or his address as of 1966, what had happened was he'd left Hollywood, and in 1966, when I would have been 9 years old, he was arrested on a DUI in the town of Fortuna, California. 1726 Willow Drive was the address on the paper in Fortuna, California. And the reason the DMV had a record on him because he was arrested for driving under the influence, and they'd taken his license. So this lady gives me the printout of his address in 1966. Which was almost 20 years before, right? And the name on the printout that she gave me was Melvin Lee, and then quote Buck, B-U-C-K, in quotes, Dobro. Melvin Lee Buck Dobro. So he had taken on the middle name of Buck Dobro. in Fortuna, California. Now, have I gone to Fortuna? No. But isn't that interesting that somebody told me in all my searches for him that the fact that he left Hollywood real quick was because he could have gone to jail for impregnating me. She could have pressed charges and all this sort of thing. So he hightailed it. I was told by this lady in Albuquerque at the Indian Affairs Department. Her name was Crystal Water Charlie, and she told me, she kind of helped me try to look him up. He wasn't on the rolls, tribal roll of any kind. And then, this was in the 80s, and then she said, yeah, up in the Fortuna area in Northern California, there was some Comanche tribe up there working in the logging industry, so he probably went up there. And then, so anyway, so that happened, and so there he was, arrested for drunk driving, and he went by the name of Buck, so he had taken on a little bit of his Indian side at that point. So anyway, that was more confirmation that he identified with his Native American part. And I might as well keep going with this part of the story too, because when I met Julie, it was all good, and I did meet her again recently. There's more to that story because we kept in touch and everything. In fact, a few years ago, I went to Los Angeles, and this is a messed up photo of me, my sister's daughter, and I stayed at Julie's house. That's her with her cat. But she didn't talk to me very much. She's a nice lady, but not communicative. Anyway, it's a faded album, but that happened a few years ago, like not even 10 years ago. So, but let me just blab this out about the father, which is why, I'm not obsessed with any of this or anything, but I made the videos, adoptee searches for Comanche father, just to put it out, because you never know. He may have had other family members, or, something may come of it. As long as you're still alive, you might as well keep the door open to look. But what happened was, I did all that finding in the mid-'80s. In 1985, I moved away from the Bay Area. My life there was over, and I moved back here to Arizona, and I met my soulmate, and we started living together in 1985. Every now and then, I'd still go about trying to look for this Melvin Dobro guy. And all we had was telephone books. You could go to the library, and you could go to the section that had all the yellow pages of the United States. And I would go to the library and one by one go through the yellow pages of all these cities and towns, because the name Dobro wasn't hard to look up. There aren't too many Dobros. So it wasn't like looking for a Smith or anything. And I finally got to a Florida, St. Petersburg phone book, and I found a Melvin Dobro in there. And I went to the house. I thought, oh my God, this got to be him. So I called this Melvin Dobro in Florida, and a man answers the phone, and I found out he was the same age. He had a wife, but he said it wasn't him. I told him straight up, and he said, well, it's close, but it's not me. He insisted. And he sounded honest. He said it wasn't him. I even called back like a couple days later to make sure. I asked him some more questions, and he said, nope, I'm not the one. Melvin Dobro was his name. Just to say a coincidence, my adoptive father's name was Elvin, and the man on the birth certificate who delivered me was named Melvin. So I was born with a couple of Melvins and then adopted by an Elvin, just to say how things rhyme in the life. So I came back, home, so I'm back here in the late 80s, and then it's like with this searching business, you kind of do a step and then come to a dead end and you do another step. And Alma had, I was still in touch with Alma, and here in Arizona, in Sierra Vista, somehow the newspaper got a hold of me. I did this newspaper article. They got interested in my story, so the lady came down to interview me. See the date. March 11, 87. Adoptee happy at finding birth mother despite pitfalls. So that was me holding up this photo of my birth mother. You can't see it, but she looked almost identical to me. My face, the way she smiled, except our noses were a little different. And anyway, that was this big story there. And then also, I was so happy about finding it. I met this other man named Gene, and we started this group called Triad that existed for a couple of years, where we helped these other people. I took all my Alma help information and met with Gene, who had found his birth mother, and then we formed a group in Sierra Vista here, and we used to, for a while we met with other people, and we did help one lady find her birth mother. But so anyway, it was a thing, you know. But so then to pursue, oh yeah, Julie, when I met her at the restaurant, she had said to me, oh, if you want to look for him, go ahead, but you probably won't like him. He's not very nice. And she didn't want to find him, but she said I could. But she said he's not very nice. And then I explained, you know, it really doesn't matter whether they're nice or not or whatever. You just want to see him. I don't care if he was a serial killer. You know, it's like you're just interested. It's like, what the heck, you know? You get born, there's a secret going on, and you want to know what the story is. And that's the motivation. Because no matter what he's like, I'm still myself, and that's it, you know. So I'm living down here back in Arizona, and then there was a way to trace people by calling the Salvation Army, believe it or not. Somehow, you call Salvation Army, you give them the information you have, and they had a database. I know the Mormon Church does. I still haven't gone there. But anyway, they had a database, so I left information with the Salvation Army. And one day there's a phone call to the house, and we had an answering machine. And I wasn't there, so my partner answered the phone. And when I got home, he said, oh, this man called. And he said he was calling you back. And I thought it was someone related to Salvation Army, because we didn't have a lot of phone calls coming in. And it came right after I had left the information. So when he said a strange man called, and I think he said about your father, but I knew it was connected to that. So I said, oh, did you get his name? He said his name was Richard Kimball, but he didn't leave his phone number. That was a man who called. And my partner had told him to call back later, but I didn't have a way to call him, the man, back. So I'm sitting there waiting, and the guy never called back. And I remember I wrote down the name Richard Kimball. Some guy named Richard Kimball called me up with probably information about my father. And, you know, I was thinking, Richard Kimball, where have I heard that name? Well, I'm not sure if I figured it out right then or it was a little bit later. And now that there's YouTube, I really get the picture, because Richard Kimball was the character name of the dude, the guy, the man that was in the TV series called The Fugitive. So a guy named Richard Kimball calls me up saying he wanted to call me about my father. At least his name is Richard Kimball. He never called back. So the other thing I did around that period of time, either before or after, probably the same period of time, was I took the address, 1726 Willow Drive, And I wrote a letter asking if they knew anything about Melvin Dobro. And I sent it. Okay, there were two things, registered and certified. The first letter I sent, registered, which means they had to sign for it. And I put a self-addressed stamp envelope. I asked the person if they knew anything about him. I left my phone number, everything, and then an envelope they could write me back. Nothing. The letter was received, nothing. No reply. I did another one, certified, same thing. It was received, no reply. So obviously, and you might wonder, well, why didn't I just go there to Fortuna? And you can look down now on Google Earth and see the house and everything. You can even see an Air Force base there. But anyhow, so that was that. And during that time, you know, I mean, it's obvious that the guy's hiding out. And when I made myself known that I'm looking for him, he's my father, and I sent an address to the house, which was 10 years later. He may not have even been in the house, but there's no answer. Even if there was a current resident, they could have said back, well, sorry, but that guy don't live here no more, or something like that. Nothing. So then I relegated the whole search to, there were two people in town that did channeling. One of them was Jane Martin. She channeled Calvin. Calvin was a group of 5 Pleiadian entities that were channeling through Jane, and there were weekly meetings that took place in the late 80s here in Bisbee, Arizona, up on the divide at Chris's house, and 15-20 people would go up there. Jane would sit in the chair and channel Calvin. And Calvin's mission here was to help us evolve our emotional body, period. Now, I had just come out of primal therapy for 6 years, and I come back to Bisbee, and here they are. There's a lady channeling these Pleiadians that are here to help people evolve their emotional body. I was in heaven, man. I was in frickin' heaven. So anyway, Jane Martin did individual readings with people. So I got a reading. I went to a session with Jane, and she would go into trance with her eyes shut, and you'd ask questions. So I asked, where's Melvin Dobro? And she indicated that she did not have permission to disclose it, where he was. And she's saying this in trance, right? In Calvin's voice. And then she asked me, why do you want to know? And I said, well, in case I never find him physically, I just want to know. And then I asked, let's see, if I asked it in this way, I said, am I his grandfather? Meaning, did I incarnate, am I the Comanche grandfather? I asked that question to Calvin, and I remember the silence, and I remember, and that's when Calvin said, why do you want to know? And I said, well, in case I can't find Melvin Dobro, to find out about the Comanche lineage part. And good old Calvin said yes. Now, you know, anyone that doesn't believe in channeling, you can say it was all made up, that's fine. But the fact that Calvin said yes, meaning that the way it felt to me too was that I'm the incarnation of that guy, the Comanche guy, because that would have, not because, but the fact that I named the snake bracelet Comanche, and because when I ran away from home, I lived in the wilderness all the time, like an Indian, so to speak, and I've just always had this viewpoint of the cities or the white man's world, and look what they've done to the country, the white man, and their industry and all, you know what I mean? I've always had this sort of Indian outlook. And nowadays, you hear people definitely remembering themselves as being incarnation of their ancestors. So anyway, in the 80s, that was the first time. That was just a way I did a search for Melvin Dobro through the channel thing, and then Calvin said he doesn't want to be found. All right, so there was that. Well, that was around 87, 88. So then, in the 90s, I moved to Washington, went to the Romtha School, life went on. Fast forward to about the year 1999 or 2000, when I came back to Bisbee. I had my son, and he was about 4 or 5. And here in Bisbee, there was a woman. Is this still recording? Yeah, there was a woman named something or other, Rosemary. And she claimed that she was a channeler. And she was in the coffee shop downtown, and she was staying in Bisbee, and she also did channel sessions. So, once again, I thought, oh, let's see if she knows about Melvin Dobro. Because, I mean, here I am, 2021, still wondering about him. And every now and then I look up to see if I can figure out what happened to him. Because that's what you want to know, like, what happened to this guy? What happened to him, He's my genetic father, right? So Rosemary was doing sessions, and she had this partner, this man that was with her. So I arranged to have a meeting, and I went to her house here in Bisbee, and I took my son with me. He was sitting on my lap, listening to the whole thing. Rosemary sat in a chair across from me, and her partner was in the room. And, I was skeptical of all channels, I mean, you could say anything to somebody and figure it out and send them on their way. Who knows if they're authentic or not. And if I don't know how to access the Akashic records of everything, and someone else does, well, you're putting your trust in them. So I know that this phenomenon is real, the channeling, and I know Romtha is real and all these things. But anyway, so here's Rosemary. And I'd been through the Romtha school already. Yes, I had tried to remote view Melvin Dobro before, but anyway, so as you could call it a sport, so there I was getting this reading from Rosemary, and so I asked her, I said, where is Melvin Dobro? And so Rosemary's real quiet for a while, real quiet, and then her eyes are shut, and then finally she goes, he's in a cave. All right, she says the word cave. That's all I can say. He's in a cave. Well, all right. Either she had gotten information about me from other people in town to find out that I had lived in a cave, or actually 2 or 3 different caves in the United States. I had spent time and even resided in one, a shallow cave, by the way. Either she scoped it out and came up with that cave story, or else she was telling the truth. And my birth father's frickin' in a cave somewhere. So that's that part of the story. And she couldn't say where. Now, how much did I know about DUMBs, deep underground military bases? How much did I know back then in the late 90s about this stuff? Well, I knew a little bit. I knew enough. How much do I know now about the whole world under our feet? And how much do I know now about the use of certain people in these scenarios? Well, I know a lot now about it. But anyway, looking back at how Rosemary said he's in a cave, if she was serious, I'm like, Jesus Christ. So what does that mean? That I inherited this frickin' Or the cave I lived in New Mexico that I'm going to write about and tell the story about. Really? That cave, I was led to it? Oh, maybe that was a cave I knew from a past life, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? So that was another lead that first Calvin tells me he doesn't want to be found, and but that I am the incarnation of his grandfather, the Comanche guy, his great-grandfather. And you know, when you think about it, let's say Melvin Dobro, who was born in 1943. Oh, this is what Crystal Water Charlie told me. She said that if he was called by Julie to the social worker full-blooded Comanche Indian, she said there were no full-blooded Comanche after 17 some, you know, that the Spaniards had killed off all the tribes out down through Texas, and I read about this, and that they had blended in with other tribes to the point where there were no full-blooded Comanches, you know, in the 1900s. And so, for whatever reason, if Melvin meets Julie in Hollywood and says, my grandfather's full-blooded Comanche, you know, if that was a thing, then he was maybe one of the last. And then if Julie, my birth mother, which I said in a different video, she was going to call me Cindy. And of course, Cynthia Quanah Parker was the half-breed white girl kidnapped. Cynthia, so here's, you know, so there was a little romanticness about the Indian part that Julia must have had to think about calling me Cindy. You know, and anyway, so there's that whole thing. So, but again, you know, all the times I've called the Comanche tribe itself, there's no Dobro on the tribal rolls. The other thing I did was I looked up a Melvin Dobro family tree. I found a bunch of Dobros in Cape Cod. I called up a man who had the name of Dobro, and he explained to me that he said, oh, I got my family tree right here, let me go get it. He went and brought this big book down, and then he told me that the Dobro clan came from Lithuania, and they separated in two families. One family was based in Ohio of a bunch of Dobros, and he had this whole long family tree of all the Dobros in his side that stayed on the East Coast. And he said he looked all the names, there were no Melvins in his family tree. He said they had reunions, they kept kind of close on each other. And Julie said that Melvin Dobro was French Comanche, or, you know, French Protestant. So, you know, anyway, I'm just blabbing all the little puzzle pieces because let's say there was this grandfather, which would have made that he was alive in the late 1800s, and he was full-blooded Comanche. And so Melvin's parents were, Melvin's mother or father, we don't know which, was the daughter of this Indian guy. So obviously he married into white people, Europeans, right? And for all I know, Melvin could have been illegitimate as well. Melvin could have been adopted as well. You know, so all these separations happen to the point where there is no way to reconnect the genetic line. The records are destroyed, the people ran away or illegitimate. You know what I mean? Earth is full of family lines who just have no connection to their lineage. And this is why a good way to kind of end this sort of story is to say, hey man, if you're adopted and you don't have a bloodline to trace, that don't mean you don't have to worry about it. It doesn't matter so much, but most of the world values your recorded lineage, bloodline. I and us other adoptees grew up without that.